So Christ's own seeking leads all of us to divinity. I mean, this is the goal ultimately, to make our faith our story and making our stories an embodiment of our faith. Hi everyone, Angelo here, and it's the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So just like last week, we are still in chapter 6 of John. And from what I understand, we'll be here for a little while, probably the entirety or at least the majority of August. And the reason for that, it seems, is because given the length of Mark, but then also given the length of the liturgical year, the two don't necessarily match up. So in order to help things balance, we sprinkle in some John. And what better can we sprinkle in than John 6? Because as much as all the Gospels are, yes, fundamental to who we are as Christians, this chapter in particular is central to our understanding of our identity and of our faith, especially if we find ourselves within the Catholic tradition. So what happens here is that this comes after last week's reading of the feeding of the multitudes. And here now we have the people who would have been among the crowds who would have been fed last week go into Capernaum looking for Christ. They're not sure if he did or not. Because in between last week's story and this story, there is the story where Jesus walks on the water. So what would have happened last week is that the people would have seen the disciples leave on the boat, but they didn't see Jesus. So they're not sure when they do encounter Jesus how he get there. And they do ask him, they're like, Rabbi, when did you come here? And then there's this dialogue between Jesus and the crowds. And then coming down to the end, this is where we have what we, commonly know as the bread of life discourse. Because this is where he begins. So at the end of the story, he's like, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never be hungry. He who believes in me will never thirst. I mean, words we know, words we're very familiar with, a lot of us. And the thing is, if you're familiar with these reflections that I do here, you would know that I try to focus mainly on the gospel and not so much on the other readings of the day. And not because those readings aren't important, because of course they all are, and they're all interrelated, and they all inform one another, which then inform our own spiritual journeys. My thing is, I just like to focus on the gospel for these reflections here. But I do look at the way the first reading would have ended, and I think it frames nicely where I would like to come from today. Because coming on to the end of the first reading, so this would be in Exodus chapter 16, I believe. Yeah, Exodus 16. And this would be when God would have sent the manna from heaven. And coming on to the end, the people, they were asking among themselves, they were saying like, what is that? And I think that question is very relevant to what we encounter in the gospel here. So, like I said, the crowd, they went in search of Jesus, and they would have followed the path, meaning they crossed the lake too. They followed the path that they saw his disciples take, not knowing whether or not Jesus was over on the other side. But they were willing to try anyway, right? They had the faith, or at the very least, they had hope that, maybe we might find Christ over there. Even though we didn't see him leave with his people, maybe he might somehow be over there. Which, sure, yeah, he was. And whether or not they were conscious of it, they were moving with that faith and that hope that so many of us aspire to. Meaning that moving through the dark and trusting God to guide us and to direct us. And when they did find him, besides trying to be like, how or when you get here, that is when the major dialogue would have started. And it was a dialogue between Christ and the people. And I'm sure these people were honest seekers, or at the very least, they would have had honest seekers among them, and not just people who were looking for more bread. And then when we look at this is what really strikes me. Because at some point, they're in the back and forth. They're asking for signs and everything too. And that is when Jesus announces who he is, that he is the bread of life. The thing is, Jesus didn't come out and say that, similar to like how he would have had his sermons on the mount and he came with his teachings. It wasn't like that. This revelation came through a dialogue. This revelation came through the people pressing Christ. So we might often experience Christ in our own lives and not recognize him. There'll be moments of divinity, probably more often than we would even like to believe. And we're not sure what happens, so it passes us right by. And it's only when we actually take it to prayer do we then begin to realize the revelation that God is revealing to us. So for me, this story very much is about dialogue, and dialogue between our own life stories, whether it's our individual stories, personal stories, or stories of our communities, but dialogue between our stories and our faith, and making our faith our story. I mean, this is the goal ultimately, to make our faith our story and making our stories an embodiment of our faith. Meaning that we live such radical lives of faith and trust in the divine that we could look to moments in our own lives, for example, where we would have expected one thing, or we might have thought one thing would happen, and then something completely and totally different happened instead. Because I'm sure so many of us could think to moments where we felt like we were all out of options and there was no logical way out, and then God shows up and God comes through. So, through things like that, we could trust that God will get us and rescue us, liberate us from our worst, because God always does. No matter, at least if you're listening to this here right now, you have survived the worst moments of your life. And we can trust that God will continue to deliver and liberate us from those as long as we continue to seek and follow. So for me, it's about faith seeking understanding too. The definition of theology, right? Faith seeking understanding. And Jesus would have done this in his own life as well. And that's how he could then identify himself as the bread of life. That's how then it could be revealed to him that he is the bread of life, and not simply Jesus of Nazareth, or, well, whatever profession you want to put onto him, carpenter, stonemason, preacher, healer, whatever the case might be. Through Jesus' own trying to seek and understand his faith, he came to understand himself as the bread of life. So Christ's own seeking leads all of us to divinity. And our own seeking too could then help lead others to experience God as well. Christ, he would have dug deep. And we too, we have the ability to dig deep. So then we could look at the things in our lives, our experiences, our stories. And we could then ask, just like the people in the first reading, what is that? What could this mean? Who or where is God in all of this? And we will get an answer. Maybe not necessarily instant like how it was here in this reading. But, well, one thing I like to say is that the answer always comes when we need it most. Not a moment sooner, which is anxiety inducing, but not a moment later either, which is comforting. God will never give us the answer too late. God will always give us the answer exactly when we need it. So same way too in our own lives, through our own seeking, trying to understand our faith. Sometimes just like this crowd here, pressing Jesus, we will ultimately receive an answer. And when we get that answer, it's then up to us to accept it or not. But at the end of the day, what we believe is that God speaks truth and God is truth. And the truth is the truth at the end of the day. Anyway, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.